introduction. Much appreciated, Ben. Normally they throw that through ChatGPT and it pretty much comes out a very attractive Irishman called Paddy who talks a lot about inclusion is pretty much my short version on LinkedIn. And I think that's maybe when Tom opened up this morning and he said this afternoon's going to take a little bit longer than we planned. I think he did realise he's given an Irishman a stage and a microphone. And when you do that, that's a bit of a problem. Expected to do a bit of stand-up as well. So thanks for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here. It is impossible to follow that lineup of speakers. You know, when Tom sent me a message about speaking, I went, sure, Tom, who's going? And he goes, Sir Anthony Selden, Professor Rose Luck. And I'm like, really? And you want me to come there? And so the challenge with thinking that through is, I've got to come up with something that's really engaging, that's really interesting, that's really inspiring. I've got to come up with something that's beyond the expected. I've got to come up with the best demos. I've got to come up with the best one-liners for you guys to leave with. I've got to come up with the most powerful impact statements. So I thought long and hard about it and I decided, no, I'm not going to do any of that. So I'm not going to go down that route because what I think is important when we think about barriers and we think about the opportunities with AI and we think about what we should be doing, we need to step back a little bit and start thinking about the obvious things. So I'm going to talk about very obvious things. I hope what I'm going to do is reinforce some of the things that we already know as educators around this room, but also align those with AI. Because I'm finding what's happening with AI is we're talking about the right things. We're talking about retaining the human connection. We're talking about empathy. We're talking about our critical skills and our questioning. But actually the challenge here is, are we including everybody when we think that through? And are we tying that back to what we're trying to pursue and achieve with AI? And I think for me, if you think about AI in general terms, we have, as educators, as people involved in the edtech space particularly, talked about accessibility for many, many years. And we've said, right, and we've used dirty words like, we're going to have an accommodation. So we're going to put something on after the fact. We're going to bolt on help. We're going to have accessibility tools and create a little bit of a stigma for those pupils in the corner that are the only ones using these particular tools. And that's what we've been trying to achieve with accessibility. In genuine terms, we've been trying to level the playing field to give every pupil the ability to reach their potential, to have access to get on the learning bus. But the challenge with that is we've focused too much on the technology and not enough on the learning. How do we get them on the bus? But the challenge about getting them on the bus is, how do we keep them on that bus? In other words, how do we keep inclusion? And for me, the reason and the only reason I talk about AI is in relation to barriers to learning. Why? Because I do feel, despite all the things we've heard about AI, we are now at a point where we can genuinely move the discussion beyond accessibility. I'm going to look at a couple of things here now and we're going to think about it. And if you think about all the tools that you've started to dabble in, some of them you've rolled out or trialed in your schools and colleges, we'll recognize there is accessibility. There is get on the bus built in there. So we have to focus on what are these wider barriers and how do we include more pupils? And so I'm not going to go beyond the expected. I'm going to reinforce, I hope, the obvious and think through some tools and some structures. What I want out of today, I want you to think very carefully as the champions, as the early movers, as the early adopters in AI in your schools. I hope you're thinking about your AI policies. I hope you're thinking about your AI strategy from a technical standpoint. I hope you're thinking about the CPD and the training and the inclusion of the whole school estate. But what I need you to go away with today is to go, I get how in my policy, how in my CPD, how in my documentation, how in my stakeholder engagement with parents, I'm going to use AI in my school to remove as many barriers for as many pupils and for as many stakeholders as absolutely possible. So that's my first slide. So you know you're going to be on a little bit longer, okay? So one thing I want to make sure that we're moving beyond, and this is not a go at a particular tool at all. It just so happens to have a generic tool on board. But I want us to think carefully about AI and go, are we actually, be honest, are we thinking beyond the normal? Are we thinking beyond how we might generate IEPs? Are we thinking beyond how we might analyze documents? Are we thinking beyond summarization? Are we actually thinking beyond that? Are we afraid of thinking beyond that with our staff and our schools? Because, hey, AI is a scary place. Do you know, 20 years ago when I stood up on stage and went, what's the most challenging thing you have in your schools? And everybody go, time. Do you know when I ask that question now, everybody says AI and not time. Time hasn't gone away. The time pressures are still there in every single school. The workload's still there. But AI is a challenge. So we've got to think about, are we only thinking about that when it comes to policy? The traditional tools that you're seeing on LinkedIn, that you're seeing online, that are solving the workload problems. Are you actually stressing it and going, well, I'm thinking about AI a little bit more, and I'm actually thinking about, well, text to speech. I'm thinking about image support. I'm thinking about how I might generate images to remove barriers. I'm thinking about comprehension, those simple summary pieces that we've all done from the day zero of ChatGPT. Accessible writing, are those tools supporting my students? Are you thinking about that in addition to reducing workload and more engaging learning? Is that the extent of where we're taking the thought around barriers? Well, what I want you to do is just think again. I'm going to go back to the point, which is we need to think about what inclusion means in the world of AI, and we need to get it embedded in our policies. And you know what? We can bring on more stakeholders in our schools, our learners, because they're more engaged. We can bring in more stakeholders on our staff. Why? Because it becomes more relevant to a wider bunch of students. We can bring in more stakeholders about AI because we can bring in our parents and we can remove barriers to them accessing their son or daughter's or child's education. And so let's think about these barriers and let's think about where AI can plug in. And I'm not going to do any fancy demos. I'm going to state things that we've heard for many, many years, but I just want you to think about it in the context of AI. The whole point in talking about barriers is very simple for me, and it's this: it's creating opportunities and supporting everyone. I have a fear, and I think Chris had the slide up earlier, where we started to see the change in equity between the disadvantaged and the more advantaged, and those changes in where AI actually stretches and challenges and supports at the bottom. We've got a big gap in the middle. We need to consider very carefully how we adopt AI, and it is there genuinely to support every single person in that classroom. And when I say person, I mean your LSAs and your TAs. I mean the teachers. I mean the support staff. I mean the children and everybody beyond those gates. So I'm going to take AI in really two stretches here. And I want you to think of AI in the first instance as, can it be a friction remover? It may not fundamentally be able to remove a barrier completely. We'll look at some of those as we go. But can it actually remove hidden frictions? Because for me in the classroom, the hidden frictions are the biggest challenges that we actually face when we start to adopt towards inclusion. The challenges that we don't know about, and we're going to come to a bit of analogy in a second. And the second thing I want you to consider as we go through these slides is, how might we move beyond basic support? It's not enough to say, well, hey, I've got ChatGPT and it has text to speech and speech to text and accessibility ticked. Very inclusive. Absolutely not. It is genuinely the tip of the iceberg, but it is a step in the right direction. How can I take that logic of different ways to engage in my learning with my technology and take it to a much wider degree? So think about those things. AI as a friction remover. Can it remove friction to learning? And how can you move it beyond basic support? And if you think about that in context of something like this, okay, we all in this room know exactly what that is. And that's, of course, voice on ChatGPT on mobile. Think about barriers that has almost inadvertently removed at this stage. Think about the fact that that one tool right now is removing a barrier of language. Why? Because it can do pretty much live translation and two-way communication. It's doing that. It's doing translation from text, from a simple photograph directly through. It's removing challenges to learning through the use of voice. How is that helpful? Well, that's helpful if I have dysgraphia, because I no longer have to start to write. I can start to speak to my device. If you have dyslexia, the ability to listen to my answers back through ChatGPT is massively increasing the potential of you understanding and comprehending the words that are on that screen right then. In one tool, multiple barriers have been removed. Think about comprehension. The things we all did when ChatGPT came out, we all went, write this at a reading age of 10, right? And we all got those pieces out. Think how powerful that simple tool is in the hands of one of your learners and also in the hands of your teachers. The amount of barriers that we remove in one swipe with understanding what our technology can do, and importantly for the purposes of today, understanding how this should and must apply in our policies. Removal of barriers, how does it remove? Is fundamental to our success in AI, because the only success in AI for me is the success of every student in that classroom. Not those students who understand AI, those students that can access their learning because of AI, and I think that's critical. And if you think about those tools that are out there right now, just think about some of these tools, and I'm not going to demo anything at this point right now, but I just want you to think about barriers only and where these tools sit. Tools like Brisket, if you haven't used it, a simple Google extension, what does it do? Translates on the fly. That will do a character chat directly with you. Automatically, it does that chat with text-to-speech and speech-to-text. So suddenly it's more accessible. It's also more accessible because it's a different approach to learning. It'll produce a podcast. So I move from actually having to be forced to read something to being able to listen to something in an engaging way. Diffit is designed at differentiation, but that helps with workload, the barrier removal to workload. Why? Because it will give me multiple leveled text straight away of a range of resources that I need. So that particular tool there will not only help me with reading levels and reading ages, it will help me with language barriers in a very busy multilingual classroom. Mizu's a very simple chatbot. Why do I mention that? Because it's not just a chatbot that we've all been used to where you type. It's a chatbot that has text-to-speech and speech-to-text already built in, and it's personal to you. Notebook LM. Lots of us in this room have a lot of love for Notebook LM. And Notebook LM has been a fabulous tool because it'll take resources, and the thing that everybody puts online is the podcasts that it produces. Why? Because it's an alternative route to understanding content. 20 minutes burst. Do you know, Chris mentioned it earlier, and I'll come to it on our parental engagement. We've been doing a project in Northern Ireland, where I live and I'm from. And there's 330,000 kids we work with in Northern Ireland in one group. Effectively, it's the whole of the country. And the challenge that they had in Northern Ireland was dyslexia support. Parents wanted to get more communication, but actually when they got it, they weren't reading it. What did we do over a pilot last year? We turned it into 10-minute podcasts. The engagement level of parents listening to 10-minute podcasts versus the open rate on an email went up by a factor of 4. They were listening to it and staying for the course, helping them understand dyslexia, helping them understand how to help their individual students. So Notebook LM, multimodal. So think about that when we're going through AI. Does this AI tool that I'm looking at, concerned to integrate, offer me multimodal tools? And I want to put this up. And some of you touched upon it earlier in some of the sessions. And I think this is really important. And it's even more important because of where we are and the wonderful mix and breadth of people that we have in this room. This was a piece done, Sutton Trust published this in July 2025. Teacher Tap did it. I think there's about 2,000 teachers on it. This number, 27, that's 27% of independent / private schools have an AI policy in place. 27%. State schools, 9%. And even that varies between whether you're outstandingly rated or Ofsted or you're in some sort of special measure. So that varies widely. If you're in this special sector where you ultimately need to rely on technology quite a lot to help you on a daily basis, only 3% of the special school sector in the UK actually have an AI policy in place. That is frightening. And we need to close that gap. But we also need to get that number a whole lot higher, and removing barriers and inclusion has to be central to that. See, if you look at that report from Sutton Trust, you'll also realise that in the independent sector, 3.5 times more teachers were trained on AI in the independent school sector than in state schools. It's a travesty. It's a terrible, terrible indictment of the entire system that we are not embracing this. And we need to level it even more. So I'm going to talk about 4 quick things very quickly just on this. And these are the obvious things. For those of you who have seen me speak before, there's 2 slides I have on every single presentation I do. This is absolutely one of them, the good old iceberg. I like to say it's because I'm from Belfast. We built the Titanic. The English sank it, that's what we always say, okay, right? We only built the thing, right? I know, yeah, unsinkable. It's not that. Why icebergs? For me, this is the perfect representation of a typical classroom. And when it comes to inclusion, why? Because if we think about how we address inclusion and how you may be thinking about AI in terms of how it might remove barriers, what we all tend to drift to is this top section. It's the bit above the water. Right, I know in my classroom 5% of pupils have dyslexia. They have been assessed, they've got help in place, AI is going to help them. I know I have got 5% of pupils with ADHD. I know how to help these students. I have the interventions, the strategies, the support in place for this. That's good and proper and right that those pupils get help. But that is not inclusion. Inclusion is about the iceberg. It's about the entire iceberg. Because here's what happens, and here's why AI is of critical importance. Because underneath the waterline, we've got 90% of our students that might sit there. They might struggle with mental health. There might be problems directly at home. They may be masking their dyslexia or their individual learning differences that they have. They are just different in the diversity that's in the classroom. That doesn't mean they have a challenge in learning, but they could have a challenge to learning. They could have a barrier. And our challenge is, when we think about AI, that we should stop only thinking about the students we know about, the dyslexia we know about, the ADHD we know about, the challenges with reading and writing that we know about. We need to focus on the holistic view of the ultimate diversity in our classroom. And the only way we can do that is to utilize the power of AI and design to the edges, is to think through how do we universally design as we go there. So I want you to remember the iceberg as we go. And if you ever see me, do challenge me on the iceberg. And I've got so many models of these to show you the huge infinite level of challenges that pupils face underneath that waterline. But the way to address that also traditionally has been how do we approach that from a universal design for learning process? How do we actually address this? And before the days of AI, this was exactly how we did it. We said, right, there are 3 different areas we need to focus on. We need multiple ways to engage our students. We need multiple ways to express content to our students. We need multiple ways to assess what our students have learnt and for them to express it. Have a think about that with all of your knowledge now today with AI, and think about, can AI do all of those things? And the answer should be a resounding absolutely yes. AI gives us the capability to remove so many of the barriers to the complexities of learning because it will help us deliver universal design. Universally designing learning means that we do design it for everybody, and by default, we remove barriers. AI gives us the capability to do that. But if it ain't in your policy, if it ain't in your CPD, it is not going to happen. And we've got to reinforce this in all of our schools, that these wonderful tools that we're getting all very excited about reducing workload and saving us time and energy, actually fundamentally have a massive impact on learning. Why? Because we can universally design learning to ensure that every single pupil matters in that. And very quickly, and I'll rabbit through a couple of these slides on this, I want to think about personalised learning. Do you know, when I joined my current EdTech company, nearly 10 years ago now, they used to talk about personalised learning a lot. And actually, personalised learning to me became a bit of a dirty word in the EdTech industry because people talked about it a lot, like we have a new personalised learning system. What does that actually mean? What is personalised learning? And actually, the reality for me is that if you think about what personalised learning is, where it came from, where it's going to, what we've got to do with AI with it. This is Michel de Montaigne, a French philosopher from the 16th century. And back in 1553, I think it was, don't quote me on that, but you can Google it. You have to think about him talking about and thinking about the power of personalised learning. What we need to do is we need to have Socratic questioning. What we need to do is to have one-on-one tuition with our students. What we need to do is have a tailored flow and pace and speed. Think about what he was saying then, and think about how the system couldn't do anything but give one tutor to one individual student. That's the only thing you could do back in the 16th century. But think about how this has went through. And if you think about this, Benjamin Bloom, love him or loathe him, 1984, that wonderful year. The report here at this stage, the research is very, very clear. If we move to a model from conventional teaching through mastery to a personal tutoring model of one-to-one, we can massively increase all the things that Ben and Steve say. We don't want to be doing that, but ultimately the system's still about measuring our students. We can measure our students to come out of that bell curve in a much, much, much better way. But more so, we can have a more rounded process of learning with them. And the only way that personalised learning is achievable and personalised learning matches the needs of every individual student and removes barriers is, guess what? What's the two letters we're here to talk about today? AI. Because AI gives us, for the very first time, from the 16th century to today, the ability to actually deliver that. Go back to your policy. Think about that. How is my policy helping personalised learning? How is it helping universal design for learning? How is it helping with my iceberg? And if you think about these things, and if you kind of sum it up, and this is not a perfect summary of personalised learning, but student-centred approach, could AI deliver that? Yep. Dialogue over memorisation, can it deliver that? Yes, if done carefully. Curiosity-driven, can it deliver that? Yes, if done carefully. It's on us to create the policies to get the pedagogical outcomes for universal design, for wider inclusion, and for personalised learning in our classrooms. The AI tools are there, they're ready, and they have the capability to actually deliver on that. So, does it deliver real-time adjustment? It'll do that. Immediate feedback? It'll do that. Does it scale tutoring? It'll do that. Will it personally pace to a student? It will do that. We need to be careful with how we do this, that we're never doing what we've all talked about today, which is replacing that human connection and that human interaction with our tutors and with our teachers. We've got to make sure that AI is not the be all and end all, but it's a wonderful supplementary path to this. Personalised learning for me achieves a lot, and in its self-paced piece, it breaks down so many barriers because it accesses learning in so many different ways with so many students. It's not the panacea, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it is the one thing that I see removing barriers because it puts the learning in the hands of the student and the emphasis on their control and their independence and their voice. And lastly, on these four pieces, before we just wrap up on the paths to barriers, is student agency. And we've talked about that in little bits in the sessions today. And I think if you think about good practice, the ultimate goal of universal design for learning, as I open with, was actually to create independent learners. That's actually the original remit of UDL. Let's have every learner be an independent learner. Agency is a critical part of that. Students in control. We've talked a lot, and I'm a big fan of guardrails, but I think we're talking a lot about the guardrails and the limitations we're putting on. Somebody mentioned university. My daughter's a third-year med student in University of Leeds. She is petrified of using ChatGPT in case she gets cut and gets cut off her assignment. Do you know what? I pay for her premium version every single month, and I know she uses it for every single one of her study notes and every review of every document. She's running the gauntlet right now. It's not doing her work for her, but it's fundamentally important. But giving students agency, and as somebody said earlier, having dialogue with students and understanding what is right and proper within this removes barriers. Because otherwise you're going to do what every child does. You're going to hide the thing out of the way, and we're not going to know about it. That's really important. So I'm going to skip past a lot of these, and I'm going to get to these. How are we doing for time, Ben? We're all right? So I want to think about this, and I'm going to sort of contradiction in terms here. I'm going to throw this slide up, and then I'm going to go straight into a slide that talks about special education needs and disabilities. I'm going to go straight into SEN. So I'm going to contradict myself on this. But I think what's really important, if we think about those fundamentals, the pedagogical piece, the inclusion piece, the personalised learning piece, the things that actually make good teaching and learning, and we think about where does it go with AI, if we summarise that, this is not about AI at all. AI should be the tool that we're able to leverage and we'll be able to grasp a hold of right now because it's here today. It should not be about send, because if I make this discussion about send, then I just make it about the top of the iceberg. That's not inclusion. That's barely accessibility at this stage. And so fundamentally for me, it comes down to these three questions. Who's missing out in my classroom? Where are the barriers and gaps? How can AI bridge them? Now, here's the truth. The truth is, if you dwell on that iceberg and you think about that iceberg and you think, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go away and I'm going to identify the 10 barriers that sit in my classroom and I'm going to get an AI solution that addresses those. You will never, as an educator or practitioner, be able to do that. That's the point in the iceberg, and we need to be very clear about it. You can never identify all of the barriers that might be placed in front of any one of your students in the classroom. All we can do in the world of AI and technology and our practice is remove as many barriers as possible. We will never get it right, but we can have sweeping moves on barriers that removes many from many students. But let's not get ourselves in the quagmire of trying to understand what barrier a particular pupil has, because that's an infinite game, to quote Simon Sinek on that. It really is. So let's not think about AI. Let's not think about send. But of course, let's go straight to send and talk about assistive technology in the next slide. And don't worry about all the words in this slide, but I just want to give you some thoughts as we go through a couple of these case examples, just to pull some of these out when it comes to barriers. If you think about lots of the tools I talked about, and I didn't even talk about our very own tool, Read and Write, which is known for years as a text-to-speech solution. If you think about something as simple as text-to-speech being ever present in many of the AI tools that you've been considering, you think about that pupil either above the iceberg has dyslexia, well known for it, has a plan in place, and is getting all the support he or she actually needs. But also think about that pupil, and we reckon it's in the region of 16 to 17% of pupils in your classroom have dyslexic traits who sit below the waterline, mask things incredibly well, and simply come across as struggling with reading. Those challenges are there. Text-to-speech on tap in your AI tools, and an encouragement to use those helps in comprehension, helps in cognitive load. And you know what AI has been wonderful in? It's in those, those lovely voices that 11 Labs are giving out now. They're friendly, they're encouraging, those warm tones. You can get them in any gender, at any age, from any ethnicity, from any language background. Do you know what those do? Those reduce stigma. It's not about it being easier to listen to in a lot of cases. It's about being represented and understanding. I don't know if any of you saw on the BBC, I think it was 2 weeks or so ago, about the lady with MND who had lost her voice about 25 years ago. I don't know if you've seen that. And they had captured an 8-second snippet of her voice on, I think, a camcorder tape as she wished somebody a birthday or talked about the baby's bottle. I can't remember the detail, but it was 8 seconds of audio. They've now been able to, with AI models, take that 8 second of crackly audio and reproduce her entire original voice for her to actually have a voice back. And that meant that her kids, who were now in their late 20s, could hear what their mother's voice sounded like. So we're at a point now where speech and language becomes less of a challenge because we're given more tools to enable our students to do more with. It's never going to go away. But the personal piece of what AI gives us is fundamentally important. Speech to text, when speech to text first came out, back in my iPad days 15, 16 years ago, do you know what everybody used to say to me in primary schools? They go, Paddy, they love the iPad. I'm like, why do they love the iPad? Well, the boys love the iPad. Like, right, we're in primary school. Why do the boys particularly love the iPad? Why? Because they were the most reticent bunch to pick up pen and paper to write. But once they found this little dictation button, suddenly they were talking quite extensively into an iPad to have things dictated. Imagine how far we've come now in the world of AI, where AI is so much more accurate for doing that, so much more accurate for doing captions, provides a voice in a busy classroom environment to any student rather than having to wear headsets. These things are helping. And also from a speech and language perspective, if you're in a specialist setting or working with pupils who have challenges with speech, more and more of these models will be able to recognize those, and they're getting better and better and better by the day. That's AI. That's unintentional AI for a lot of you. But these are barrier removals. Think about selling this, quote unquote, to your colleagues, to your students, to your colleagues, and them understanding that they have an impact with AI beyond this workload piece. Live captions, simplified language, of course, for comprehension, we've talked about in AI, and image generation. If you think back to universal design for learning and good practice in terms of engaging content for our students, it is producing them with alternative forms. It is being able to give them access to image content. Has anybody in this room ever, until today, been able to create images faster than they now can in some of the AI tools you have that are more accurate in a better way and more representative of learning? You want a comic book on the sinking of the Titanic? I'll give you one inside 30 seconds and it'll be quite amazing, okay? Through a few line prompts. Those are different ways to engage. Those remove barriers for cognitive load in many different ways. So again, we want to be thinking through exactly how AI supports us in this. But I also want you to think about other things. You know, if you have a look at the vast majority of research, particularly around learning challenges, learning difficulties, learning differences, however you refer to it, early diagnosis, is that important? Absolutely. Early diagnosis, early intervention means actually we can get to the nub of the problem and address it, okay? We can never fix it, remember that, with learning differences, but we can put the tools and technology in place to make sure those students have removed those barriers. And if you think about where we are with AI, you know, simple tools like Talamo that sit out there right now, a simple AI-powered dyslexia screener, hybrid between machine learning and AI tools, now being able to have pupils screened really, really early and establish whether there are dyslexic traits that sit there. We can now do the same on ADHD. It's just an indicator. It's getting better. Do you know there was another story? I think I do nothing but read the BBC News. It's so many times on a plane. But there was a story just last week about the reinvention of the stethoscope. Anybody read that one? So reinvention of the stethoscope. The stethoscope, somebody fixed my age piece here, 1835, somewhere around that, the original stethoscope. Relatively unchanged in all this time. Now, the AI part of a stethoscope that they've developed can actually very accurately tell you instantly 3 different types of heart condition that you have. It can actually tell you and predict if you're going to have a heart attack in the next 12 months. Was what the story purported to say. And this was a robust medically researched story. So if you think about how we're going with diagnosis, that means early diagnosis is there. If we start to look at AI for screening, we start to look at how we can help. We do actually in that case remove a barrier and use AI to drive that barrier removal. And if you think about how that moves through the system, what should we be considering about AI? Well, we should be considering, if we've had diagnosis and we've put place in intervention, how is AI now going to look at how that student learns, how that student grows? How's it going to analyse that data? And how's it going to give me as an educator the human touch feedback that I need to help that child grow and prosper even more? And AI is sitting there right now as effectively a co-pilot of learning analytics. So when we're thinking about our AI policies, is that relevant to us now today? Or is the first piece, how do we actually diagnose and screen? You know, we did a test with one of these tools about 2 years ago, an early test. And again, forgive me for talking about dyslexia a lot. It's very close to our hearts in every way, who do pay me to fly here, by the way, so I better drop their name in the odd time. And we took a school, simple control school, and we did it over the course of 2 years. And we did no dyslexia screening. Transition school, straight into year 7. And pupils came through, and we had about 4% of the students actually had dyslexia. As in they had been formally assessed and had a plan in place to support them with dyslexia. We give them an opt-in to a dyslexia screener. We don't make it. This was a third-party piece, but we were interested in the results. On an opt-in basis, it moved up to 24% had dyslexia markers within that same cohort. The following year, there was a mandated piece, and the mandated piece was, right, every child is going to be screened on that year ban. Wrote to parents accepted. There was only 2 pupils actually opted out then at that stage. 34% dyslexic traits flagged in that screener. Their is a 30% differential in the barriers that AI now today could exist in to remove barriers to those students learning that nobody in that school would ever known about. That's just one school. That's not representative across the country. It may be a corner case, but it's very, very illustrative of what we do know. In the case of dyslexia, 5% of students sitting in a diagnosed bucket. Average guess is 17% of any classroom has dyslexic traits. That's just one individual learning difference, one piece of neurodiversity that we need to consider. So when you think about that, personalised learning pathways we've been through, but think about those chatbots. Think about adaptive platforms that you're starting to consider for your school. Think about where AI tutors fall in. The best examples I've seen of personalised learning are customised chat bots that are sat and directed by an individual school. That's not practical in every single school setting, particularly when we've got 9% of state schools only have an AI policy, never mind somebody that can write a custom bot internally in school. So we've got challenges there. So we need to look at what tools off the shelf can we bring in that can help us be an AI tutor, but never, ever, ever replace the human connection. What are safe and secure? Some huge horror stories out there of the guidance that certain chatbots have given, particularly in the US for some reason, maybe higher use cases there. But we need to be thinking at the very least about adaptive pathways. Somebody mentioned Sparks earlier on in a presentation. Tools like that are very useful to create an adaptive pathway. It's not truly personalised learning, but it is reducing barriers. Why? Because if I struggle on a particular question, I'll go back until I can improve that. So think about that. But the bottom piece here actually for me is the most important piece of this. Why? Because it fits across learning differences. It fits across cognitive challenges. It fits across special needs. It fits across universal design for learning. It fits across inclusion, multimodal capabilities in any of the AI tools you're looking at. And putting that in control of your students and not just your teachers creates different pathways to learning, removes barriers as we go. So very quickly on these last couple, belonging and voice. Let's not forget about these things because those are very real barriers. I don't know if you would believe this, but in 4th year in school, I had to do a piece for my English oral as part of my GCSE. This is many, many years ago. I'm 51 years of age. It's a long time ago. My English teacher sat me down at the end of that and said, Patrick, I'm sorry, but if you ever had any hopes of speaking in front of a crowd, it's never going to happen. Now, this is why I do what I do, and I've never met that English teacher since then, but she challenged me then that you don't have what it takes to speak in front of somebody, right? Not a great example of a teacher who motivates you and strives you forward. She wouldn't be the one of my, which teacher do you remember from school type teachers? But the thing is, I was a relatively shy student in terms of the ability to come out to people around the room. I was shy. I had thoughts here. My teachers would say, he is very, very lazy. Why? Because I wasn't motivated, and more so because I couldn't express myself very well. I just wasn't interested in the things that were going on. How do we create belonging and give students a voice through AI? Think about that in terms of our policy. Can we address belonging? Can we address voice? Simple things like rephrasing, like sentence starting in an English or a writing piece, are very useful. The ability to anonymously assign Q&A pieces, to actually deconstruct a piece of group work activity that was recorded and deconstruct that and provide the ability for a student to play that back and analyse it in a different way. We need to be thinking about multimodal approaches. These are not new things. These are pedagogically underwritten things. These are things that we've talked about through the ages and ages of EdTech, but actually we haven't had the tools that are there by second nature. The reason you're here, I hope, is that you have a passion and a driver that AI can make a positive difference in your schools. Please do not let it be just for a minority of students and your staff that experience that. Please ensure that AI sits in your policies to benefit every single student. And I know you say, but it does, Paddy, it does. It doesn't if you don't consider the barriers that you need to remove. So building belonging and voice. And family and community. I mean, you think about some of the stats, some of the barriers that exist. We have schools that we work with that are sitting there, and I'm not sure about your own context, and some of these numbers might be different in the room, of course. I have schools that are sitting with 70, 75 different mother tongue languages in their school. You think about reaching out to that school community and you're sending out your super fancy parental communication piece and you're sending them out a letter that actually has been cross-checked by the principal 3 times for punctuation to make sure it's actually suitable to go out of my school. Do you understand that in our society that we are in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, I always have to add that bit, our average reading age is 13. Like, that's our average reading age. Like, that's our challenge. The Guardian said at 14 of a reading age. Think about that. That's a real problem. Now, if you think that you have in this country and English isn't your first language, how are you going to read a piece of parental communication? If you think about how your literacy level might be low and you do not speak English, how do we reach out? AI gives us the answer. Those 71 languages, done like that, made available. And also the example that Chris shared earlier, and I talked about it from a Northern Ireland perspective, the ability to have that as a podcast for somebody to pause, rewind, pause, rewind, pause, rewind, translate, whatever you want to do with that content. That's the definition of universal design for learning. Giving empowerment to the individual to consume that piece of content or learning in the way that they actually need to. You're looking at me now, Ben. We're nearly wrapping. So, almost done there, and we're going to get to the second slide that I have on every presentation. But if you think about this win, what is a barrier in the send process? And we'll not over-egg this slide, but it does come down to workload. How am I writing my IEPs? How am I constructing my EHCPs? How am I producing that application for access arrangements? What am I doing in terms of workload? And how can I take AI into that mix and understand how AI can help? Do you know what? That for me is a barrier to adoption for a lot of your staff. And there's a lot of ways we know as advocates in this room we have to sell what we're doing in terms of CPD, in terms of new policy to our staff. But workload is clearly there in SEND process. Please, please, as we start to wrap up, don't forget this. This is really important, the inequity gap that's there. But I think you got to look wider at that. And if you're thinking about your AI policies, think also about the pupils that may be sitting at home that don't have the levels of connectivity required, don't have the age of devices that they actually need. If you're not in a one-to-one program and in an area of high Wi-Fi, it starts to become challenging. So think about your AI policies and what tools can you actually roll in there. Something like Microsoft Office Lens will do lots and lots of AI things directly offline. Lots of OCR tools will do them offline. If we're thinking about removing barriers and we're expecting students to be empowered by using certain elements of AI within their guardrails, we need to make sure they can use these everywhere. Not just on their phones, not just on their iPads, on their devices, at home, in school, absolutely everywhere. So do think about that. Think about group work we talked about. Assessment, of course, we talked about as well, but this comes back to multimodal pieces. Can we redefine our pieces of assessment? Can we use AI to produce different outcomes and produce different results and different ways for our students to express their learning? So I'm going to go to this slide before we go to the last slide, but that's this. And it comes back, I hope, when you remember at this stage, after all the words that the funny, specky Irish guy on the front of the stage has said to you, all right? Which barrier will you remove first? This is not the question to absolutely ask. Because what we will do there, if we get up on a CPD day and we're working with our staff, we're going, right, okay, which barrier will you remove? We know about the top of the iceberg. We know we've got to support pupils with dyslexia and ADHD, dysgraphia, and all of those neurodiverse challenges and learning differences, and there are many of them in our classrooms. We know what we have to do there. We cannot possibly guess at what's underneath that waterline. But what we can do as a community is think about AI through a slightly different lens. Think about not just how does this impact the learning? Think about how does it remove barrier? Because by doing that, we will design for the edges when it comes to learning and implementation. And if we do that, we will create better outcomes for our students. And if we do that, we will have reduced as many barriers. In my mind, AI is the greatest force for good for barrier removal, for inclusion, for accessibility, and for equity. but it has to be done right, and it has to be done as standard across this wonderful country of all of ours together. We need to be really, really, really actionable in what we do, and we need to be really actionable to make sure that AI has a central tentpole within it that is inclusion. And I'm going to finish off with this slide here, which many of you who've saw me speak will absolutely know. I never leave home without this slide. This is really important. I could bore you to death about these set of steps. I won't do it. Okay, there's a big story behind this. But this is really, really important. Okay, here's the challenge. When we think about AI, when we think about EdTech, when we think about technology, we're thinking too much about this necessary for some. Do you know what pains me? When somebody phones one of my team at the office, right, and they go, we would like to buy your read and write software. And we're like, yeah, absolutely. Well, we have 4 dyslexia kids in our school. Could we just have 4 of them, please? And we go, no. Phone goes down. Right? I'd rather not have them buy that. Why? Because that produces stigma. And actually, that is a prime example of a tool, as is many of AI's, that's necessary for some, yes, but it is useful for all. Please take that EdTech piece and that EdTech thought as you leave today and go, right, how do I apply this into AI? How do I make sure that I design for the edges? And it might be necessary to help some outcomes. It might be necessary to help some barriers. But ultimately, does it give our students the agency to use their own choice and voice to drive their own outcomes and be more engaged? I hope that was useful. I hope you please bear in mind barriers as you go. And I'm probably late, but that's okay. I'm sure there's a break coming up. Thank you for listening to me today. Do please look me out later on today if you want to have a chat about that. Thank you.